A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Alright, we have a heavy hitter today from Daniel. He wants us to get into the weeds on something that usually gets handled with a lot of emotion and very little math, but we are going to do the opposite. He wrote in and said, "Let's discuss the shifting demographics of Israel and what a change in the proportion of the ultra-Orthodox and Arab populations could mean for Israel's future."
Herman Poppleberry here, and Corn, I have been looking at the updated numbers for 2026, and the word shifting is almost an understatement. We are looking at a fundamental rewiring of the Israeli state.
It feels like one of those topics where everyone has an opinion based on a headline they saw 5 years ago, but the ground is moving faster than the discourse. By the way, quick shout out to Google Gemini 3 Flash for powering our script today. It is helping us navigate this massive pile of data Daniel sent over. So, Herman, let's start with the big picture. People talk about the demographic time bomb all the time, usually referring to the Arab-Jewish birth rate gap. Is that still the primary story?
Actually, no. That is the first big misconception we have to clear up. The old narrative from the 1990s was that the Arab birth rate would eventually overwhelm the Jewish majority. But if you look at the 2025 and 2026 data from the Central Bureau of Statistics, that bomb has essentially been diffused. The Arab fertility rate in Israel has plummeted and converged with the Jewish rate. In some cohorts, Jewish women actually have a higher fertility rate than Arab women now.
That is a massive reversal. What changed?
Urbanization, education, and middle-class aspirations in the Arab sector. But while that front has stabilized, a new internal divergence has opened up within the Jewish population itself. The real demographic story of 2026 is the meteoric rise of the Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox, community versus the secular Zionist middle class.
So the median Israeli is changing. If I walk down a street in 2040, who am I seeing?
Statistically, there is a very high chance that person is either Haredi or Arab. We are moving toward a reality where the secular, tax-paying, army-serving backbone of the mid-20th century is becoming a numerical minority. In 2025, the Haredi population hit nearly 1.5 million, about 14% of the country. By 2050, they are projected to be 25% of the total population and one-third of all Israeli Jews.
1/3? That is a lot of black hats and long skirts. And this is not just about who is at the playground, right? This hits the budget, the military, the high-tech sector, everything that makes Israel look like a first-world country.
It hits everywhere because the Haredi community, by design, operates a parallel society. We are talking about a group where 54% of the men do not work in the formal economy. They study Torah full-time. And because they have an average of over 6 children per woman, while secular Jewish fertility is drifting down toward 1.7, the math starts to look very scary for the Ministry of Finance.
It is like a biological compound interest. If you have one group growing at 4% a year, and another group barely replacing itself, the crossover point happens sooner than you think. But before we get into the gloom and doom, let's talk about the Arab sector. You mentioned their fertility converged, but they are still 21% of the country. Are they integrating into the startup nation side of things, or are they also part of this parallel economy problem?
It is a mixed bag, but there are some really encouraging signals there that contrast sharply with the Haredi trend. Arab women are enrolling in universities at record rates. In 2025, they made up about 17% of all higher education students. That is a huge engine for future GDP. The problem in the Arab sector is more about male employment and the internal violence that has plagued those communities recently, which stalls economic development. But unlike the Haredi leadership, which often actively resists secular education, the Arab middle class is fighting to get into it.
Okay, so we have two rising sectors. One that wants in but faces structural hurdles, and one that has historically wanted out but is now becoming too big for the rest of the country to carry. Let's talk about the education piece, because Daniel mentioned the lack of core studies crisis. What does that actually mean for a kid born in a Haredi neighborhood today?
It means that if you are a Haredi boy, there's a 50% chance you will reach age 18 without ever having a formal class in math, English, or science. The curriculum is purely religious. This was fine when the community was 3% of the population. The state could afford to subsidize a small group of scholars. But you cannot run a modern, nuclear-armed, high-tech economy when 30% of your future workforce cannot read a circuit diagram or speak English to a client in New York.
And this isn't just a theoretical problem anymore. We saw this in the 2026 budget negotiations, right? The Knesset budget stalemate was essentially a fight over this exact issue.
It was a fiscal emergency. The Haredi parties demanded another 1.2 billion shekels for their independent schools, schools that do not teach core subjects, in exchange for staying in the coalition. The secular parties were losing their minds because that money is essentially a bribe to keep a generation of children unemployable in the modern sector. If you don't teach a kid math, you are essentially sentencing him to a life of poverty or state dependency.
And 45% of Haredi families are already below the poverty line. That is the highest of any group in the country. How does the state even stay solvent if that group becomes a quarter of the population?
That is the 10 trillion shekel question. The Israel Democracy Institute put out a report recently warning that if this integration gap isn't closed, Israel could see a 10% drop in GDP per capita by 2050. Think about what that does to your defense budget. Think about what that does to your healthcare system. You start looking less like a Mediterranean tech hub and more like a struggling developing nation.
It's a weird paradox because Israel's overall fertility is actually the envy of the Western world. Most of Europe is shrinking, but Israel is growing. But it's unbalanced growth. It's like a body where the legs are growing at 5 times the rate of the heart. Eventually, the heart can't pump enough blood to keep the legs moving.
That is a great way to put it. And the heart, in this case, is the small slice of the population that works in high tech and pays the vast majority of the income tax. I think the top 10% of earners in Israel pay something like 90% of the total income tax. And that top 10% is overwhelmingly secular or modern, religious. If they feel like they are being milked to fund a society that doesn't share their values and doesn't serve in the military, they have options.
You're talking about brain drain. Daniel's notes mention that 2024 and 2025 saw a net loss of residents for the first time in a long time. Who is leaving?
It is the people who can leave, the doctors, the engineers, the researchers. We saw a crude outmigration rate of 83 per 10,000 residents in 2024. That is the highest in recent history. A lot of it is remigration. People who moved to Israel from the former Soviet Union and are now moving on to Germany or Canada. But we are also seeing native-born Israelis looking at the demographic writing on the wall and heading to Cyprus or Greece. They want a lifestyle migration where their tax money goes to schools that teach science, not just Psalms.
It's a feedback loop. As the Haredi population grows, the tax burden on the secular minority increases, which makes the secular minority want to leave, which increases the Haredi percentage even faster. It's a demographic death spiral for the Zionist vision of a modern Western state.
And it's not just about money, Corn. It's about blood, the burden of service. This has moved from a political annoyance to an existential manpower problem for the Israel Defense Forces.
Right, because the IDF isn't getting smaller, but the pool of recruits is. If 27% of the kids in the Hebrew education system are Haredi and they don't enlist, the kids who do enlist have to stay in longer and do more reserve duty.
The Manpower Cliff is projected to hit by 2028. We are looking at a shortage of 10,000 combat soldiers. You cannot defend a country in this neighborhood with a shortage of 10,000 soldiers. The 2025 reserve duty extensions were a breaking point for a lot of people. You had guys in their 30s being called up for their 3rd or 4th stint in 18 months while seeing buses of Haredi young men heading to yeshivas. That level of social friction is unsustainable.
It creates a two-state reality, but inside the borders of Israel. Two economies, two education systems, two different ideas of what participation means. But what about the Arab sector? We talked about them integrating more. Could they be the third way that saves the economy?
They are the wild card. If the state can successfully integrate Arab men into the high-tech workforce and Arab women continue their upward mobility in medicine and academia, they could provide the fiscal cushion Israel needs. But that requires a level of political trust that is currently at an all-time low. After October 7th and the subsequent regional tensions, the relationship between the Jewish state and its Arab citizens is delicate, to put it mildly.
It's funny because you have these two groups, the Haredim and the Arabs, who are both traditionally non-Zionist, or at least have a very different relationship with the state than the founding secular generation. If they ever realize they have similar interests in terms of religious autonomy and welfare spending, they could theoretically form a massive political bloc.
That is the nightmare scenario for the secular center, a joint list Haredi coalition. They wouldn't agree on much regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but they would agree on decentralized education and massive child subsidies. They could outvote the secular center on every fiscal issue.
So, let's talk about the war bump. Daniel mentioned there was a baby boom among Jewish women after the war started in 2024. That's a very Israel phenomenon, isn't it? In most countries, a war makes people stop having kids. In Israel, they double down.
It is a unique cultural resilience. When the tribe is under threat, the biological response in the Jewish sector has historically been to increase the birth rate. We saw this after the Yom Kippur War too. But here's the nuance, that bump is mostly in the religious and national religious sectors. The secular fertility rate is still trending down toward European levels, around 1.6 or 1.7. So even the resilience is pushing the demographic needle further toward the religious end of the spectrum.
So the median voter is getting more religious and more right-wing every year. Daniel said there are 500,000 new voters in the 2026 cycle who fit this profile. That essentially locks in a certain type of government for the foreseeable future, doesn't it?
It makes a center-left coalition almost mathematically impossible without a massive realignment or a split in the Haredi ranks. The demographic gravity is pulling the country toward a more traditionalist religious identity. And that has huge implications for things like the Abraham Accords and regional integration. A more religious Israel might be less interested in Western liberal norms, but more aligned with some of the traditionalist monarchies in the Gulf in a weird way.
That is an interesting angle. But back to the economy, because that feels like the real ticking clock here. We've talked about the lack of core studies, but what about the internal community support? Daniel mentioned these gemaks, the internal Haredi lending networks. Is it possible they've just figured out a more efficient way to live on less money?
They have. The Haredi community is incredibly efficient at poverty. They have massive social capital. If you need a stroller, someone gives you one. If you need a loan, it's interest-free from a community fund. This is why their food insecurity is lower than their poverty rate suggests. But social capital doesn't buy F-35 fighter jets. It doesn't build desalination plants. A state cannot survive on gemaks. It needs a massive, high-margin, export-oriented economy to pay for the big state functions of defense and infrastructure.
Right. You can't crowdfund a national missile defense system. So, Herman, what are the leading indicators we should be watching? If a listener wants to know if Israel is successfully navigating this demographic fork, what should they look for in the news?
Watch the core studies legislation. That is the canary in the coal mine. If the government manages to tie funding to the teaching of math and English, there is hope for economic integration. If they continue to give blank checks to schools that teach 0 secular subjects, the GDP per capita decline is almost baked in. Second, watch the Arab male employment numbers. If that starts to climb, it's a huge win for the fiscal base.
What about the tech sector? They're the ones who usually scream the loudest about this. Are they doing anything to tap into these pools?
They are trying. There are some great programs for Haredi women in software development. They are highly disciplined and very smart, and because they are often the primary breadwinners, they are motivated. But it's a drop in the bucket compared to the total population growth. The tech sector is also starting to recruit more heavily in the Arab sector, particularly in the Triangle and Galilee regions. But the cultural gap is still a hurdle.
It's almost like Israel is becoming a metropole for the Jewish world, like Daniel mentioned. We're exporting this intense religious high-fertility culture, while the secular startup types are becoming a global diaspora themselves, living in Berlin and New York but keeping their Israeli passports.
It's a complete inversion of the original Zionist idea. The idea was to bring Jews from the diaspora to Israel to create a new Jew who was secular and worked the land. Now, the old Jew, the religious, traditionalist one, is taking over the land, and the new Jew is moving back to the diaspora. It's wild.
So, let's get into some practical takeaways for the folks listening who might be looking at this from an investment or policy perspective. If you are an investor in Israeli tech, does this demographic shift change your 10-year outlook?
It has to. You have to account for a potentially shrinking pool of native talent and a rising cost of labor as the tax burden increases. However, Israel is also a world leader in automation and AI, partly because it has to beat. If you don't have enough soldiers or workers, you build robots. So, the demographic pressure might actually accelerate the next wave of Israeli innovation in robotics and autonomous systems.
Necessity is the mother of invention, and Israel has a lot of necessity right now. What about the Golden Age projection? Daniel mentioned that by 2065, Haredim could be 30% of the population. That feels so far away, but for a kid born today, that's their mid-career reality.
It's their world. And the question is, will the Haredi community change as it grows? We're already seeing some new Haredim who want to work and serve in the military but keep their religious lifestyle. They are a small minority now, but they are the only path forward. If the community doesn't modernize internally, the state as we know it won't exist in 2065. It will be something else, more like a religious Mediterranean state, maybe more like Lebanon in its sectarian structure.
That is a sobering thought. The Lebanonization of Israel. Different groups with their own schools, their own militias, or versions of them, and a weak central state that just tries to keep the lights on.
That is the risk. But Israel has a habit of muddling through crises that would break other countries. The 2026 budget vote is going to be a huge stress test. If they can pass a budget that includes even a little bit of reform for Haredi education and military service, it shows the system still has some give in it.
Is the tension between identity and economics. You can't eat identity, but you also can't force people to give it up just for a higher GDP. I also want to circle back to the brain drain point because I think people underestimate it. If you lose the top 1% of your scientists, you don't just lose their tax money, you lose the entire industry they would have built.
One genius engineer in Tel Aviv creates 500 jobs. If he moves to Palo Alto, those 500 jobs move with him. That is the fragility of the startup nation. It's built on a very thin layer of high-performing individuals who are globally mobile. They are the most sensitive to these demographic shifts.
And they are the ones who feel the burden of service the most. If I'm a high-end AI researcher, and I'm being asked to go sit in a tank for 60 days a year while my neighbor's kid stays in a library, I'm going to start looking at LinkedIn for jobs in Zurich.
And Zurich is looking for you. That is the competition. It's not just a domestic policy debate, it's a global competition for talent. Israel's demographic exceptionalism, its high birth rate, is its greatest strength, but only if it can turn those children into productive citizens of a 21st century state. Right now, it's mostly producing citizens for an 18th century state.
That's a sharp line. We're essentially overproducing people for a world that doesn't exist anymore, and underproducing for the one that does. But I want to give some credit to the Haredi community here. Their social cohesion is incredible. In a world where loneliness and deaths of despair are skyrocketing in the West, they have zero loneliness. They have total community support. There's something there that the secular world is missing.
There is, and that's why they aren't leaving. Their retention rate is incredibly high. Even the ones who struggle financially stay because the community is their whole world. If you could combine that level of social cohesion with a high-end secular education, you would have a superpower.
Haredi high tech. It's happening in small pockets, but it needs to be the norm. So, let's wrap this part up. The demographic time bomb isn't Arab birth rates, it's the fiscal sustainability of a parallel religious society. The Arab sector is actually integrating faster than the Haredi sector in many ways. And the secular middle class is the squeezed middle that might just walk away if the pressure gets too high.
That's the summary. It's a tripolar struggle, and the 2026 budget is the opening bell for the next decade of this fight.
Alright, let's look at some actionable things for the listeners. If you're following this, what should you actually do with this info?
First, if you're an employer in Israel or working with Israeli companies, you need a Haredi and Arab recruitment strategy. Not as a charity project, but as a strategic necessity. That is where the labor pool is. If you don't know how to hire from those sectors, you're going to run out of people.
Second, track the quarterly Central Bureau of Statistics labor force surveys. Don't listen to the politicians. Look at the participation rates. If Haredi male employment starts ticking up past 60%, that's a huge buy signal for the Israeli economy.
And third, keep an eye on the core studies metrics. There are organizations like the Taub Center that track this specifically. It's the single most important data point for Israel's long-term solvency.
It's wild to think that the future of a nuclear-armed state might depend on whether 10-year-old boys in B'nai Brak are learning long division.
It really does. The pen is mightier than the sword, but the calculator might be the mightiest of all in this case.
Well, that is a lot to chew on. Daniel, thanks for sending this in. It's a fascinating, if slightly terrifying, look at the math behind the headlines. It really highlights the tension between the Jewish part of the state and the Democratic part, when the median voter might not be a Zionist in the traditional sense.
It's the ultimate stress test for the Israeli model. Can you be a melting pot if the groups don't actually want to melt?
We'll find out over the next 20 years. Herman, any final thoughts before we close this one out?
Just that demographics are destiny, but policy can nudge destiny. Israel has corrected course before when its back was against the wall. The question is whether they recognize the wall is already touching their back.
I think the 2026 budget vote is the moment they realize it. All right, let's wrap this up. Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Model for providing the GPU credits that power the show. We literally couldn't do this deep dive analysis without that compute.
If you found this useful, or even if it just gave you a mild existential crisis, please leave us a review on your podcast app. It really does help the algorithm find more people who like this kind of nerdy deep diving.
You can find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive, RSS feeds, and all the links. We've got over 2,000 episodes now, so if you're new here, there is plenty to catch up on.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We'll see you in the next one.
Peace. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We shape.